Bienvenidos to the Bronze Titan podcast on YouTube. I'm your host, Benjamin Ramos of the Pro Libertad Freedom Campaign, and I'm an independent journalist and Cuba Solidarity activist based here in New York City. And from time to time, I'll bring you a podcast from the international movement to end the U.S. blockade against Cuba. On today's segment, we'll be speaking with Danny Valdez of CubanAmericans for Cuba about the recent humanitarian convoy to Cuba and a little bit about the work that CubanAmericans for Cuba does. I love that name. I love that concept. Welcome to the Bronze Titan, Danny.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Likewise, I'm glad we're able to finally meet,
Yes.
online and finally able to talk. So let's get into the meat of the matter. So Danny, tell me about CubanAmericans for Cuba, because that is an amazing name. It's an amazing concept, and it's something we have not seen in the left in a very long time. Go for it. What's going on?
Well, in a sense, it's kind of sad that a name like that, which should be, to me, the baseline, that if you're Cuban American, you support Cuba, you want what's best for Cuba and Cubans. But unfortunately, that's not exactly the position of many Cuban Americans, specifically those in South Florida, where you sort of have like the backyard of Marco Rubio and Maria Salazar and all of these kind of hardliner Cuban Americans that are in Congress and in power. But the idea of CubanAmericans for Cuba is that, there are 2 million Cubans that live in the United States. And I know that the vast majority of them support normalization, support, a lifting of U.S. sanctions on Cuba, support engagement over escalation with Cuba. And the problem is that we're not really very organized as a contingent. They have a very well organized and a very well funded sort of right wing echo chamber operation that they're operating, and their goal, it's more mask off now than ever. Their goal is to basically turn back the clock and revert Cuba into a neo-colony of the United States. That's what Cuba was before the Cuban Revolution. It was the playground of the American elite. It was the playground of the Italian mafia. And there was a dictator in power who basically was a puppet of the United States. And that really is what the Cuban Revolution sought to overthrow. It was a nationalist revolution. It was a revolution about reclaiming Cuba's sovereignty. And, I think political forces and other factors did push it, into being a socialist revolution, a communist revolution in the end. But the original impetus was less Karl Marx and more Jose Marti. That's really who Fidel and, the July 26th movement and all the other movements involved in the revolution, that was their North Star at the time. So to me, Cuba's sovereignty is of utmost importance. The health and well-being of the Cuban people is of utmost importance. And to me, nothing about the way that U.S. policy is oriented toward Cuba right now enables those two things. It strangles Cuban sovereignty. It strangles the Cuban economy, and by virtue strangles the Cuban people. And we need an oppositional voice to these policies that is Cuban, that is Cuban American, and that is out front and saying, very much taking a page from, young Jews at the height of the anti-genocide movement. They were at the forefront, and they were saying, "Not in our name." And that was very powerful, and I think it lent moral weight and credulity to that movement. And I think we're in a similar moment with Cuba, where many Americans are starting to connect the dots between, why they can't afford their own health care and why we're spending all of this money, time, resources that could be going toward domestic investment, toward improving their own lives, and instead is being squandered on these, imperialistic adventures in the Middle East and in the Caribbean. And I want Cuba to be part of that moment, part of that awakening, because Cuba's, in a sense, it's been the longest running victim of U.S. imperialism, and just happened to have put up a really good fight for the last 67 years, and so has not succumbed to it. But I think Cuba is in a critical moment right now. Even more, I think maybe its most vulnerable moment since the revolution. And I'm not here to say that the revolution did everything right, or that the Cuban government is a perfect entity, or that it's there are real problems in Cuba, and not all of them are caused by U.S. policy, but U.S. policy makes every problem exponentially worse and exponentially more difficult to solve. And so at the end of the day, we're here to say, look, we don't pay taxes to Cuba. We don't have that much political influence over what happens in Cuba. But the government that we as Cuban Americans are paying taxes to is using those taxes and using our names to enact this, basically a mass starvation campaign on the people of Cuba right now. And that's what we're standing up against as Cuban Americans for Cuba.
Is it an easy process? Because Danny, I think about from the Boricua perspective. You can get a room full of Puerto Ricans together, and we're getting along, and we're friends, and we're family. And then we start talking about colonialism and the status, and that's when the claws come out, the anger comes out, and the disunity occurs with that. When you get Cuban Americans together in a meeting, in a home, anywhere, what is that experience like?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing, and it's something I think that we're all kind of learning to navigate. And there's two dimensions of it, really, because there's one dimension of people dealing with their own personal and family dynamics, with having differences on this issue, and in certain cases, like going to Cuba, which is seen as this huge betrayal and taboo. And then there's your own personal unlearning, because at least for me, I grew up in Miami with Cuban parents and Cuban grandparents, and it's just kind of steeped. You're steeped in that culture of anti-revolution, anti-Cuba. Really, is what it is. It's an anti-Cuban sentiment that is held and harbored by Cubans, who feel in some way or other that the Cuba that they knew was kind of taken from them. And what that means in practice in terms of what people's lives in Miami were like when they were in Cuba, that's a separate conversation. But like, I always try to approach it from a sense of like understanding it as one, class grievance, and two, like real unprocessed trauma that my grandparents and my parents lived through. I know it's not easy psychologically to leave everything everyone the language that and come to a place and have to start life all over again. And that can really create some lifelong and multi-generational trauma, and I think that's what's happened. And that plus the political environment in Cuba, which is, in Miami, which especially now, I think more than ever, is just full of these right-wing grifters who have created this echo chamber. It's just a toxic mix. And so our idea is we want to create a very low barrier of entry organization. And you have to acknowledge that there's an embargo, and you have to be in favor of lifting the U.S. embargo. Now, there are some people who want the embargo lifted because they believe in Cuba as a socialist project, and there are other people who want the embargo lifted because it would give the government, it would mean that the government wouldn't have any more excuses for their awfulness or their incompetence or their this. So there's a whole range of reasons why people would come to this understanding. And we're attempting, I say attempting because, like you say, no es fácil, to get all these people together and try to stay focused on what we're united on, right? We're united on ending the U.S. blockade. We're united on affecting the politics that we as American citizens can actually affect. And I think what I try to always argue is that, like, if you're not a fan of Cuba's politics, the embargo and Cuba's politics are completely intertwined with each other. You should not expect a liberal democracy or whatever it is that you want in a government that has to govern under basically wartime conditions, right? Under siege conditions. That's not a place where you're going to find a flourishing of democracy and, you know, all of that, the more traditional Western style democracy and all of that stuff. So, you know, all of that stuff is intertwined. In Cuba, many people say that it's the place frozen in time. And I think that's true, and that's true politically for Cuba as well, because the severity that of limitations and restrictions that they face, not just with trade to the United States, but indeed internationally. Okay, we're talking about a country that does not have international credit. No bank will lend them money because they're worried about getting sanctioned by the United States. And so most of the things that Cuba buys and imports, it has to buy in cash. Okay? What country in the world, you tell me, capitalist, socialist, whatever economic model that country practices, what country could operate without credit? What country could operate without a drop of fuel coming in for almost 4 months, 5 months? You know, these are extreme conditions that Cuba has been operating under. And we need to, I always say, if we want to understand the full story of why Cuba is the way it is, we cannot only focus on the government part of it, which is a factor. You know, like, of course, no government is going to do everything right. And there are things to critique. There are things to want changes on. And certainly I would agree that the pace of change in Cuba has been too slow. Right? But we can't leave out the role of the United States in all of this. Because we'll never understand the full story, and we'll never be able to actually solve the problem at hand here, right? Which is making sure that people in Cuba can have a life of basic dignity, and like can have an economy that is functional and that works for them. That's the basic goal. And so trying to stay focused on what unites us. Of course, it's easier said than done, and it's not always going to be successful. And there are some people who you're just not going to get along with and who will become your ideological enemies. We've already seen that. And you just kind of have to understand that this is a political fight. And you have to fight it on those terms, I think.
And unity is never easy.
Yeah.
Danny, you were talking so much about the fuel embargo. You're talking about the fuel blockade. You were talking about people, you know, not having basic needs. And one of the main reasons why we wanted to bring you on today was to talk about the humanitarian convoy, which I believe you were
Yes.
part of.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about, for a lot of folks who were not aware of it, what exactly happened? Who was participating? What was taken? What was it like to be in Cuba?
It started pretty soon after Trump announced this oil blockade on Cuba. The idea started going around of doing what was then a flotilla, because it was organized. The initial call and the initial organizing for this was done by Progressive International, which is the same group that did a flotilla to Gaza last year. And as it evolved, it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they sort of came to realize that a couple of boats is not going to cut it this time, and so they expanded it to be this convoy where there were boats that went there, but lots of aid came by plane, and it came from all over the world. There was an Italian delegation that came that was made up of a bunch of different countries in Europe. They all met in Rome, and they got a charter plane from Rome full of cargo back over to Havana. There were lots of individual flights that went, and then I was on a flight that was organized by Code Pink, which left out of Miami. It was a charter flight. With our flight had, I think, 6 tons of aid on it, and we had about 170 people in our full delegation. And I personally was also in charge of a smaller group, much smaller than 170, thank God, of Cuban Americans. And so there were about 20 of us altogether who went on this convoy specifically as Cuban Americans to say, basically, not in our name, right? We don't want this done in our name. We're here to embrace our brothers and sisters in Cuba, sometimes literally our brothers and sisters. And we're here to stand with them and to say they're not alone, and to say we reject this policy of collective punishment, and we stand with them at the end of the day. That's why we were there. We hand delivered a lot of aid. We hand delivered aid to hospitals. We also organized we collected aid specifically for LGBTQ groups in Cuba. Like, for example, condoms is something that's very difficult to get in Cuba. I don't think there's been a condom in Cuba for like 3 years. And we brought thousands of them with us. So that's legit, to go from no condoms to having thousands available, that's a big deal. So, the thing about the aid stuff is it makes a difference. But it's a drop in the bucket, mostly, of what is actually needed. Because what the country needs right now is not necessarily humanitarian aid in the form of like food. Although, of course, it's helpful. It needs fuel, and that is what is being held back right now from Cuba. But this aid convoy, and it was so great to actually be in Cuba, and to talk to Cubans about daily life, and what thought processes they were going through. And there are all stripes in Cuba. There are people who couldn't wait for Trump to come in, believe it or not, and they're all the way to the other side of being just completely opposed. Most people obviously did not want military intervention of any kind, which makes a lot of sense when you live in a place that you don't want to see bombed. So yeah, it was really impactful being there and talking to Cubans and delivering aid during this LGBTQ meetup. We also had like a drag show, which was really kind of this moment of defiant joy, in a way, in the middle of everything that was going on. And people in Cuba appreciated our presence there, and it was good to be home. I always find myself having so much deja vu when I'm in Cuba. It feels so much like Miami, where I grew up, or I should say Miami feels a lot like Cuba. Whatever the order is, one feels like the other. Yeah.
And quick question, Danny, was this not the first time you've ever been in Cuba?
No, it's not the first time. The first time I went was in October of 2023. And then I went back in October of 2025. And this is my this convoy trip in February was my third time being in Cuba.
And that experience, again, I'm glad you talked about how well received you were by the Cuban people. What did you see? There's been a lot of hardship. There's been, again, the escalation of this fuel blockade has just been insane. What was the vibe? What did it seem like? What did it feel like?
Yeah, I'll tell you that from October 2025 when I was there to February 2026 when I went back, there was a notable degradation of the situation. By that I mean way more trash on the street, because one of the consequences of not having enough fuel is you can't pick up garbage as frequently, and so trash is piling up on major streets in Havana. There's just more visible desperation. You get asked for money, for medicine, for stuff a lot more than I've ever experienced in the times that I've been. So there's clearly more desperation. And of course, the number one thing is the darkness. Because even when the grid is up and running, they still have to ration electricity, and so people have 4 or 5, maybe 6 hours of electricity a day, and at night, it's especially felt because you walk through whole neighborhoods that there's no power, there's no electricity. Um, yeah, that was a really stark thing. Like just looking out over the city and how dark it was. And then we were there on a night where we actually did have a nationwide grid collapse. And that was even more insane because then it was pitch black when you looked out. Little glimmers of lights here and there, flashlights and things like that of people on the street. But that just made it feel extremely real. And just, think about, we take for granted how much we rely on electricity for like everything that you do in your day. And in Cuba, it's like the water pumps rely on electricity. So when there's prolonged blackouts, people run out of water. They can't pick up. It's not just I can't put gas in my car, right? Like that's a very important thing for people to understand. Like this has thousands of knock-on effects, right? Think about, transporting food, right, from the places where they're grown to the places where it's sold. That requires gasoline, right? That requires fuel. Like I said, picking up trash, that requires trucks, that requires garbage trucks, that requires fuel. There's so many places where you can just see the impact of it very visually and viscerally, right? You experience it firsthand, and it's sad. Other times I've gone and I've had a good time, but this time there was like kind of a distinct kind of sadness, desperation in the air that I haven't felt in Cuba before. So I think people are, just trying to get through every single day. And that's exhausting. Like people talk a lot about Cuban resilience and the resilience of the Cuban people, but it's like they don't have special DNA that makes them any more or less resilient than any other person that is forced to live in conditions like this, right? Like they're resilient because they have to be, not because they want to be. And they shouldn't have to be resilient just to get to tomorrow. They should have a life of dignity, right? They should have a life where their country can develop on its own terms. And we're just straight up saying, no, you can't do that in our backyard. That's really what it's all about at the end of the day. So yeah, it was a tough experience emotionally this time. But I always come back politically very fortified when I go to Cuba. Like I come back more sure than ever that this is what I want to be working on right now, and it's an important thing to be working on. But socially speaking, psychologically, emotionally speaking, this time was a little bit more difficult.
Well, see, that fortification is very much an example of that Cuban resilience.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
yeah,
it's in us. I agree. There's nothing nothing genetic about it, but it is a nature nurture type of argument.
Yeah, exactly.
What's next then, Danny? Convoys have happened. We know that there's all of this situation. We know that there's a movement. I mean, Trump has said it very clearly. Mm-hmm. He said it indirectly, yet very directly. Cuba is next. Mm-hmm. What happened in Venezuela is going to happen in Cuba. What's happened in Puerto Rico is going to happen in Cuba. What's next? What can we do to support Cuba? What can we do to make sure that there isn't a coup, that there isn't a military invasion?
Well, in terms of what will happen next, obviously Trump is kind of unpredictable, and you can't really rely on him to do the rational thing. But obviously, the rational thing is to make a deal here of some kind. Remains to be seen what kind of deal Cuba would even get, because I don't even know how much leverage Cuba even has at a negotiating table at this point. But what Cuba does have is a fierce defense of its own self-determination, and so does that make military escalation more likely? I don't know, because I think they understand that there are many more institutions of the revolution in Cuba than there were in Venezuela, where in Cuba, the revolution kind of remade society, right? It built these institutions that did not exist before, or expanded massively ones that were there. And so it's not going to be, and I think he found this in Venezuela too, honestly, and in Iran. You can't just swap out the top person, or you can't just take out the top person and expect tangible, meaningful change. And I think that's especially true in Cuba, where, there are a lot of people who criticize Cuba because there is this sort of military economy in Cuba, where the military basically operates a monopoly on various industries that's kind of outside of the government. So that's real critique right there. But what I mean to say by that is not so much a critique. It's kind of an understanding of how power flows in Cuba. So the idea that there would be a military coup in Cuba is kind of never going to happen, because there just isn't that culture, and the military is not necessarily as independent from the government as it might be in other places. So I don't know, it's sort of like immovable object and unstoppable force coming together. And the result, obviously my hope and prayer is that some sort of diplomatic solution happens here. And I hope it's one where Cuba does not become a vassal of the United States, but I don't think it's likely that they would agree to a deal on those terms. I think Trump and his people understand that a military intervention in Cuba would be pretty destabilizing, not just for Cuba, but for the region. It would pull the alliances and stuff in the region in interesting ways. It would definitely cause migration to the United States, which is a thing they claim they don't like. Which I don't know if they're that's probably part of their analysis as well. So it's a extremely complicated situation, and then you throw Trump on top of it, right? Who is could wake up tomorrow and just kind of yeah, fuck it, let's go, for no real rhyme or reason. I think what we have to do, especially as Cuban Americans, we have to take back the narrative about Cuba in this country, which is that all Cuban Americans they hate the government, they hate Cuba, they support maximum pressure, they support sanctions, and to a certain extent, they even support U.S. military intervention in Cuba. And we have to come out and say, number one, that's just not true about what the vast majority of Cuban Americans want, because if you look at stuff like the FIU Cuba poll as an example, which has been done since 1991, you'll find, 52% they say, yes, I support continuing the embargo. But 73% support the sales of medicine to Cuba. 78% support this unlimited sales of food to Cuba. So basically, if you ask them in their constituent parts, what you get is a much more diverse answer, right, about how the United States and Cuba should actually have a relationship, right? They're not saying, I don't want the United States to have a relationship with Cuba, which is what the embargo essentially is as far as trade goes. They're saying, yes, medicine and food and important things and should be sold and traded. So we have to come out as Cuban Americans and say, not in our name. We really have to take that moniker up for us and say, we want engagement. We don't want escalation. We don't want our family on the island to be hurt or killed, frankly. We don't want them to be living through what they're living through right now. And we certainly don't want to be adding any anxiety to their lives about a potential U.S. attack, which I've heard several times from people that I know in Cuba, that people are anxious. People are worried. So on top of the stuff they're living through day to day, now we're adding even more trauma and stress and all of that on top of it. I mean, it's a miserable situation that we've caused there. Like it is just unimaginably cruel that we're doing this just because we want to an island of 10 million people. And we have to be out in front and speaking out against it. There are a couple of bills in Congress that are going around. There was one that was supposed to come up for a vote today, a war powers resolution on Cuba. However, the Republicans managed to send it back to committee without being voted on. So it's back in the Foreign Affairs Committee. So we're kind of starting from scratch there in a sense. There's another set of bills, one introduced by Representative McGovern from Massachusetts, that essentially repeals a lot of the congressional laws that make up the embargo, like the Helms-Burton Act and other legal parts of the embargo that are there and sort of help to prop up all of the sanctions and the state sponsors of terror. So there are bills that we can back. There's that kind of activism that we can do, which many of us are very versed in doing, and basically a pressure campaign, right, to back these two bills, because it will take an act of Congress in order for the blockade to go away, because it was codified into law in the 90s. So it will take acts of Congress. It will take a lot of pressure. And I think honestly, the piece that is missing or has been missing is Cubans and Cuban Americans saying, we don't want this either. We want a different approach. We want one that respects the sovereignty, that respects Cuba's self-determination, and that actually puts the interests of Cubans out front.
Thank you for bringing up the legislation. Definitely, I was hoping to get an update today, and it's really sad. But yet, at the same time, sad that it's been pushed back to committee. But again, I love the perspective that you have, that we just have to start over, and we can start over strong. In fact, there was even a call-in campaign that was set up for today. Hopefully, there'll be several more.
Exactly.
Folks, there'll be more, and there'll be opportunities to write to people's local elected officials to support.
Look, they could have voted and killed the bill, which is not what happened today. Which to me tells me they didn't know that they had the votes to kill the bill, and so they pulled a procedural move and sent it back to committee because they wanted the bill today that went before the Senate. We were trying to bypass the committee with a vote. We're basically forcing the vote on this issue because it's very urgent. But they did have enough votes to send it back to committee, but they didn't. To me, it seems like they didn't have quite enough to kill it outright. Otherwise, they probably would have done that.
And
so
starting from square one is not bad.
Yeah, and it's not really square one, because like you said, everything is additive. You can learn from every experience. You could build on every experience. And every time we go around, we get better and better at it. And it's really just about the relentless kind of hammering away at these tiny little cracks that we find, right? Until one gives way a little bit more, and then we hammer a little bit harder, and then another gives, like that's really, unless we want to have a revolution of our own,
which would not be bad. Which
yeah,
is not
I mean,
a bad.
not the worst outcome, I think. But that's what we've got right now. It is to me a kind of a wholly inadequate answer to say Congress, because it's kind of a joke at this point. But I do think that backing the stuff in DC and also creating a movement with the size and sort of ferocity that we saw against the genocide in Gaza for Cuba, which has basically been enduring, a 67-year slow motion genocide. I think if we can connect those two and see them as one struggle and bring Puerto Rico in there as well, obviously, and all of these things are connected. They're all funded by the same cabal of evil people, and I think it's incumbent on us to have a truly internationalist understanding of the way geopolitics is playing out in different parts of the world, and see it as part of the same sort of imperial project. And so by opposing one, we have to oppose kind of all of them. And I'm hoping we can get Cuba to a place in the United States where more people want there to be engagement and normal relations with Cuba than there are right now. Even though there is, like in the U.S., the majority of Americans, according to polls, want the embargo to go away. So there's already popular support for a change in U.S. policy toward Cuba. Now we need the political will, and we have to make it politically costly to not engage with Cuba. That's the real task in front of us. We have to make it politically costly. Just like right now for a Democrat, even in rural places and places we would never expect, it became politically costly to continue to back Israel. And we have to bring that same political costliness to wanting to maintain the embargo and the blockade against Cuba.
So we have a lot of different fronts that people can work on.
There's
right.
Education,
there's building student movements, there's reaching out to unions, there's so much, and of course the legislative work. I mean, again, we're at a certain point in which we can build and make certain voices even stronger. Danny, how do people connect with you? Especially if there's a Cuban American listening to this and they're like, wait a minute, Cuban Americans for Cuba, what is that all about? How do we connect with you guys?
Yeah, our website is, we have two versions. We have CubanAmericans4Cuba.org, all spelled out, all lowercase. If that's too long for you, we have CA, Cuban Americans, the number 4, CA4C, CubanAmericans4Cuba.org is the other, if that's easier to remember. And there you can find, we have an open letter that we have circulating for Cuban Americans to sign. We just passed our 500th, I think that's how you say that, 500th signature on there. And they're Cuban Americans from all over the country. It's actually really inspiring. Once you leave the Miami bubble, wow, you find people have a variety of opinions on what should happen next. Cuban American, asking your representatives to back some of the bills that I talked about a little bit earlier. And we're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, the same handle, CA4C. And yeah, find us, connect with us, and if you want to get more involved, fill out that open letter. There's a little checkbox there that says, I want to get more involved, and we will be in touch with you. It's going to take all of us. It really will. So if you're interested, if you're Cuban American especially, and you want to get on board, please do. We'd love to have you.
And for those of you that are not Cuban American and just a person of solidarity, there's lots online. There's CUBA, the coalition here in New York, New Jersey. There's the National Network on Cuba. A lot of listeners to the Bronze Titan podcast, you know these organizations: IFCO Pastors for Peace, National Network on Cuba, CUBA Coalition. NNOC is a wonderful resource because they have listings of organizations all over the United States. So if you live in Cleveland, there's probably Cleveland Solidarity Group that you could hook up with. If you live in Philadelphia, if you live in Los Angeles, if you live anywhere in the Northwest, there is, if you go to NNOC, you will be able to find a Cuba committee, Cuba organization, a Cuba collective that you can join. So again, mi gente, this has been your April edition of the Bronze Titan. Thank you so much to Danny Valdez for speaking with us today. Thank you for being our listening audience.
Thank you for having us. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, and it won't be the last time. Let me do the YouTube commercial, you guys. Please subscribe to our channel. Like this podcast and share it with friends. Click the notification bell so you know once a month you'll get that notification that there's a podcast with some good info for you. Y como siempre, Cuba sí, bloqueo no.